Welcome to this discussion on a new report, Danger in Dialogue, American Catholic Public Opinion and Portrayals of Islam, which has been written by a member of the Bridge team, Jordan Denari Duffner. Islamophobia has grown exponentially in the U.S. and Europe in 2015. Many would say it's at an all-time high. And negative media coverage of Islam and Muslims have definitely hit an all-time high. A recent study of European and American media coverage found, looking just at the U.S., the U.K., and Germany, that 8 out of 10 stories focused on extremism and terrorism, and that even mainstream stories, more than 50%, had a negative or anti-Muslim tilt to them. There's a lot of material on our website if you go to it to see these studies, particularly studies done by Media Tenor. Anti-Islam and anti-Muslim bias, discrimination, hate speech, and hate crimes have increased sharply in political debates. If you look at the situation in Europe, or if you look at the situation in the United States, the rise of right-wing parties and the extent to which they're doing quite well in elections in the last few years. And if you look at our own situation in terms of the Republican primaries and the ongoing presidential situation, particularly with candidates like Trump, Cruz, Carson, Gingrich, and Santorum. We all know Trump's quotes. I don't have to go through them. But I think Cruz made one of the really incisive ones, and that is a policy of saying, well, why don't we just go over and carpet bomb? It's a good way of framing it. The other was with regard to the immigration issue, which of course has been a big debate both in Europe and America, with regard to Syrian refugees who are in fact victims of a war, but the almost hardline position taken by a number of not only right-wing parties in Europe, but even leaders in European countries, and the hardline position being articulated by Mr. Trump and others who would support it, which is almost a zero tolerance in terms of immigration. In fact, it is a zero tolerance in terms of immigration. The Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding's Bridge Initiative, and the title of our initiative is actually The Bridge: Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia. Before we see Islamophobia as a threat to the very principles and values that America is based on, and certainly one of them is pluralism, religious pluralism and political pluralism. We have a multi-year project which was launched in 2015. And I hope, again, that you will visit our site, which is just basically bridge.georgetown.edu. Our research program studies attitudes and behaviors towards Muslims and documents how attitudes and behaviors towards Islam and Muslims today affect domestic and foreign policies in the U.S. and Europe, as well as in the Muslim world. And it does a lot more than that. We store an awful lot of data and articles, not only our stuff, but other people's stuff on our website. And we have all kinds of programs and approaches that we're both working on and that we've already have out there. Today, we will hear about the report, Danger in Dialogue, American Catholic Public Opinion. Hear about what its results are and the implications of those results in terms of our society. Let me contextualize it, though, by saying that Catholics are not alone in the significant number of Catholics who have a real problem with Islam, which is the way I would phrase it. If you actually look at data, we find that it cuts across sectors of folks, not just in terms of religion. A large percentage of our population has these problems. I would only say that you need to take a look at, for example, major reports from Pew, Gallup, Zogby, and others, just for the hard data before you even get into the analysis. So now I'd like to present to you the author of our project, who will also magnanimously handle the rest of the program so I can just sit here and sleep. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Esposito, and thanks to all of you for being here today. We have a full house here at Georgetown's Riggs Library and dozens and hopefully more viewers watching the event live streamed over social media. If you're following along on Twitter or want to join in the conversation, the hashtag that we're using is Catholic Muslim Bridge, which you can see on some of the slides. Before beginning my presentation, I'd first like to wish all of our Muslim friends an Eid Mubarak. Today is, Muslims are observing Eid al-Adha, which is the Muslim feast of sacrifice that commemorates Abraham's sacrifice to God and God's loving mercy in the Islamic tradition. And so many Muslims all around the world are celebrating today, and so we wish you all a happy holiday. So we think that this report is important and relevant for a number of different reasons. In recent weeks, we've seen Catholic leaders who have been in the news for some of the statements that they've made about Islam and Muslims. You might have heard back in July when Pope Francis made headlines for insisting that we must not conflate Islam with violence. And then more recently, Cardinal Raymond Burke insisted that Islam indeed does promote violence and that Catholics and Muslims don't worship the same God. But until now, we haven't really known much about what ordinary Catholics themselves believe about these questions. And our report helps to change that. And as Dr. Esposito said, we think it's particularly important that this report and this research is coming out of a Catholic and Jesuit university, and coming out of the Bridge Initiative and the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, because our mandate is to build bridges between Christians and Muslims and to draw attention to Islamophobia. So that makes it very important for us to undertake this research and share it with all of you today. And we hope, I should also say that we hope that this report is especially informative for American Catholics as they navigate relations with the Muslim community today. So now I'm going to be presenting the report's main findings, talk about the significance, and recommend some ways that Catholics might use the report to inform their own work. And our esteemed guests will also touch on that as well later in the program. So you can follow along in the report, which many of you here have in a printed version. And if you're looking online or joining us over the live stream, you can now access the PDF on our website, which is bridge.georgetown.edu. We'll also have a Q&A portion at the end of the event, so if you have specific questions about methodology or more specific things that I don't touch on, please feel free to ask at that time. The first section of our report looks at American Catholics' attitudes towards Muslims, Islam, and interreligious dialogue. And to do that, we worked with CARA, which is the Center for Applied Research on the Apostolate, which is based here at Georgetown. And they helped us conduct a nationwide survey of American Catholics. And to our knowledge, this survey is really the first of its kind. It was an in-depth survey of Catholics nationwide about these topics. And so the poll was conducted with English-speaking Catholic adults over several days in April of 2015. So here are some of the main takeaways from the poll. Catholics are slightly less likely than the general American public to know a Muslim personally. Our poll found that 3 in 10 Catholics reported that they personally know someone who's Muslim, and other polls have shown that it's closer to 4 in 10 of the general American public that claims to know someone who's Muslim. The poll also found that very few Catholics have interacted with Muslims in the context of interreligious dialogue or social activism or community service. In the past 5 years, only 7% of American Catholics have participated in these sorts of activities with Muslims. And as I'll touch on throughout the rest of this presentation, we'll see that those who know Muslims personally or who have participated in dialogue in these sorts of activities sometimes have very different views about Islam and interreligious dialogue than those who haven't. So it's the importance of personal interaction. Our poll found that few Catholics say they have favorable views of Muslims. When we asked about their overall impression of Muslims, 3 in 10 Catholics admitted to having unfavorable views of this religious group. And only 14% said that they have favorable views. A plurality, 45%, chose sort of a neutral option for this question. They said they had neither favorable or unfavorable views, and 11% of Catholics were not sure what they thought. But those who know Muslims personally, unsurprisingly, have more positive views of Muslims as a whole. 24% of those who know Muslims have expressly favorable views compared to just 9% of those who don't. We also asked some questions about Islam and violence, and we found that nearly half of Catholics believe that Islam encourages violence more than other religions. A quarter also responded that Islam encourages violence the same as other religious traditions, and a quarter were unsure. And then we also asked this question about Muslims condemning terrorism. We asked Catholics if Muslims had sufficiently condemned acts of terrorism that were committed in the name of Islam, and they were split. Half agreed and half disagreed. Another important finding is that nearly half of Catholics can't name any similarities between Catholicism and Islam, or they explicitly say that there are none. So we asked an open-ended question about what Catholics thought the strongest similarity between Catholicism and Islam is. And these were the respondents' answers. A quarter said they didn't know. A fifth gave a very generic answer, which is a belief in a supreme being or a higher power. Another fifth said expressly that there were no similarities between the two religions. And then you see some of the other answers about 12% with the shared belief in monotheism, things like that. But if you combine those that said don't know and those that said nothing, you get about 45%, almost half of Catholics responding in one of those two ways. We also discovered some interesting findings about Catholics' religious literacy about Islam. So the vast majority of Catholics correctly identify prayer and fasting as important parts of Muslim life. But they also incorrectly believe that Muslims worship the Prophet Muhammad. We also found that a majority don't realize that Mary and Jesus are important and honored figures in the Islamic tradition. But Catholics do seem self-aware about their lack of understanding of Islam. Only 1 in 10 feel that they know a lot about Islam. But we found that half also say that they're not interested in learning anything more about Islam. So there's a lack of curiosity among some Catholics. We also found that Catholics place more of the blame for poor Catholic-Muslim relations on Muslims rather than on themselves. So we gave respondents a number of scenarios or realities, and we asked them how much of an obstacle each of these things were to improved Catholic-Muslim relations. And Catholics more often identified Muslims' potential shortcomings or faults as major obstacles to good relations, rather than mentioning Catholics' faults. So as you can see from the chart, the 3 statements about Muslims top the list, whereas the statements about Catholics are of less concern. It's important to note, though, that those who have done dialogue or community service with Muslims are more likely to acknowledge the ways that Catholics might contribute to poor relations between the two groups. The poll also found that those surveyed who consume Catholic media often have more negative views of Muslims than those who don't. It's important for me to first mention, though, that most Catholics don't consume Catholic media frequently at all, whether they be print publications, online outlets, TV, radio. It's a minority of Catholics that say that they frequently consume content from these websites. And so here we can see the respondents to our survey who frequently consume these different publications and what their views of Muslims are. But it's important to note that due to the small numbers of those who responded that they frequently read an outlet like America or Commonweal or some of these other outlets, we look at these outlets and we see that because of the small level of respondents, these numbers are not projectable to the entire American Catholic population. This general finding about comparing the consumers of Catholic outlets versus those who don't, that's a larger number. But when we get down, by outlet, the numbers aren't quite expandable to talk about all of the readers of America nationwide. So some other interesting takeaways that I'll mention. 1/3 of Catholics agree that Catholics and Muslims believe in the same God. A quarter are unsure, and a plurality, 42%, disagreed. We also found that over half of Catholics, 55%, believe that it's possible for a Muslim to go to heaven. When given, this is an interesting question, so when given options for what the Islamic headscarf or hijab most symbolizes in the view of Catholics, a majority of Catholics, nearly 2/3, responded that they think the hijab symbolizes modesty. That's compared to only 1/5, which said that the headscarf to them symbolizes oppression. Half of Catholics, 52%, agree that Muslims today are experiencing prejudices similar to those that Catholics might have faced in earlier periods of American history. And this was a question we asked to measure Catholics' awareness about Islamophobia or the prejudice that Muslims might be facing today. Our poll also found that very few Catholics know what the church teaches about Islam or feel that the church teaching informs their views about Islam in any way. And lastly, we found that a majority of Catholics who reported that their priest had talked about Islam in homilies or from the pulpit said that the priest gave a neutral impression of the religion. So that's a majority of Catholics whose priest had talked about the religion found that the priest portrayed it neutrally. 30% said he presented a favorable view of Islam, and 11% said that he gave a negative impression of the religion. So we hope that these survey findings can shed some light on Catholics' attitudes towards Muslims and towards Islam, and they give us a sense of Catholics' religious literacy or lack thereof when it comes to the religion of Islam. And so with these poll findings specifically, we think they can be useful to Catholic religious educators, catechists, and help them put, in their interfaith education outreach, their dialogue programs, things like that. And we also think that it will be informative to Catholic clergy who are ministering to American Catholics during a time when Islam consistently is in the news, and also at a time when American Catholics are facing prejudice and discrimination more often. So now I'm going to run through the next few sections of our report. And the second portion of our report, as you'll see, looks at how Islam is discussed in Catholic media online. And if you have specific questions about the methodology, again, I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A portion of the program if you have any questions. So we found over a year period that, so this year period was 6 months prior to and after our poll. We found that 9 major American Catholic outlets published nearly 800 articles about Islam or Muslims online. So this part of our research looks at this news coverage of Islam online in Catholic outlets. And we looked at the top words that were used in headlines of articles that talk about Islam. And we found that Pope Francis topped the list. This might not be super surprising since these are Catholic outlets, but we thought it was significant. We also see other words like bishop, refugees, attack that are coming up in the headlines of articles about Islam. And so here we just have a graphic that gives some examples of how Pope Francis came up in headlines about articles on Islam. We also found that Pope Francis came up often among the top words used in Catholic outlets' tweets about Islam. But Pope Francis was not the highest in this group of words. The top words were dialogue and violence. So these are words in Catholic tweets about the religion. And I think what the data about the tweets shows and the data from the headline shows, particularly when we see words like Pope Francis, bishop, cardinal, as you can see here, that it shows how Catholic religious leaders are often shaping the way that Catholics are consuming content about Islam, at least as it comes from Catholic outlets. I also just want to point out that here we also see words like attack and condemn. I was really surprised to see this word condemn in the top 10 here, but what it seems to indicate is that religious leaders are either calling on Muslims to condemn terrorism or themselves condemning terrorist attacks. We also looked at the sentiment and the emotion that was conveyed in these article headlines. And we found that all of the outlets but one had negative sentiment in their headlines about Islam. And the majority of these outlets also had anger as the primary emotion that was conveyed. So if many of you have seen the movie Inside Out, you'll know the 5 emotions that a computer can read: joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. So of those 5 emotions, anger came through most prominently in Catholic headlines about Islam. So interestingly, related to this, the two outlets that didn't mention Pope Francis in their headlines at all were the outlets that also had the most negative sentiment in their headlines. And the outlet that referenced Pope Francis the most had the most positive. It was the one outlet that had positive sentiment about Islam. We also found that half of the time the word Islamic was used in Catholic articles, it was in reference to the Islamic State group. So we looked at how often Islamic State comes up compared to other phrases with the adjective Islamic in it across each of these 9 outlets. And we found that one outlet, Catholic News Agency, had the highest ratio of referencing ISIS compared to other Islamic topics. And this was interesting to us because when we looked at Catholic News Agency's readers, they were the readers that most strongly agreed that Islam encourages violence more than other religions. So the frequent mentioning of the Islamic State group might sort of explain that finding from the poll. It might give us some answers there. In the report, I'm not going to go through it all now, but you can see how these 9 Catholic outlets compare to one another in terms of their coverage of different topics related to Islam. So whether it be the Islamic State terrorist group, interreligious dialogue, evangelization, war and peace, Christian persecution, these sorts of topics. The report then goes on to look at for-sale Catholic resources on Islam. So there are over 100 books, audio programs, DVDs that are sold by Catholic publishers that discuss Islam as its main topic or as a very prominent topic in the materials. So here are some important findings from our analysis of these materials. Interreligious dialogue comes up frequently as a topic in these books. It was one of the top words that came up in the titles. You can see some of the other words as well. World was another very prominent word that came up in these titles, which might indicate that Islam is seen as, one of many world religions or as a sort of distant religion. But we also found that differences came up a lot in these materials too. So in books and in materials that sought to introduce Catholics to Islam or sought to compare the two religions, differences is the primary word that comes up when these books are describing what they're trying to do for their audience. We also looked at the sentiment of the titles of these books, just like we did with the news articles. And when we looked at all of these 100+ books, the sentiment was slightly positive. But when we zeroed in and looked at the introductory and the comparative materials, the sentiment was negative. So there was a difference in how Islam was sort of being discussed or the tone around it when you look at this larger body of books and then single into these introductory and comparative materials. I should also mention that the primary emotion conveyed in the titles of these resources was fear. So that's a little different from the news articles. We also wanted to know what the authors of these materials were trying to do in the books that they were writing or these different materials they were contributing to. So we asked, what do they hope their readers take away from this book? What do they hope they do with this information? And we found that a plurality encourage their readers to engage in dialogue, to do peace building, to build relations, to cooperate with Muslims. But some also hoped that they would evangelize, that they would share the faith with Muslims. Others talked about growing in one's Catholic faith or judging Islam for oneself. I'll also mention from this section that the 2 books on Islam that were sold by the most Catholic publishers, so by multiple different Catholic publishing houses, are Inside Islam, which is a book by Daniel Ali and Robert Spencer, and The Bible and the Quran by Jacques Jaumet. And that book appears in all 3 Catholic bookstores here in DC, which is something I'll get to very shortly. So we hope that these findings about the Catholic news outlets and also about the publications from Catholic publishing companies provide a clearer picture about how Catholic publications are discussing and portraying Islam. Just briefly, I'll skim over our 4th and 5th chapter. Our fourth chapters look at the authors who have published the most on Islam. So we profile Catholic authors who have contributed or written at least 2 resources on Islam, one of which is one of these introductory or comparative materials. And of the 7 authors that we looked at, a majority wanted their readers to evangelize Muslims, to share the faith with Muslims. Some of these materials authors also recounted their experiences of dialogue with Muslims, and 3 of these 7 actually referred to Islam as a threat to Christians. So you can see the profiles of these 7 authors in the 4th chapter of our report. And from this section, from chapter 4, I think readers might be most interested to know that Robert Spencer, who has been named as a part of the Islamophobia Network, and his organization has been labeled a hate group by a number of different organizations. He's written extensively on Islam for a Catholic audience. His articles have been published in numerous Catholic outlets, or he's been quoted as an expert in some Catholic outlets, and you can see the full list of those in the report. And we also note in this section that other actors in this Islamophobia network have shaped conversations about Islam in Catholic circles, appearing in Catholic media. And there are a few Catholics who write regularly for Catholic outlets on the topic of Islam that have direct connections or are funded by these Islamophobic organizations. So in our 5th and final chapter of the report, we look at how all of this translates into the brick and mortar bookstores here in DC, where we also find books by people like Robert Spencer and others sold. And it's unclear, I should say it's unclear that many Catholics who are consuming or promoting this content are even aware of these authors' connections to groups that have been pointed out in different reports that look at Islamophobia. So even those who are selling or promoting his materials, in bookstores here in DC may be unaware of their profiles and activities. And so we hope this report can just bring some awareness about this. And we think that knowing this information will likely impact how Catholics decide to publicize or consume different Catholic material on Islam. So we hope that this report brings awareness and understanding that's been lacking about how American Catholics view Islam and how different Catholic outlets and publications portray the religion. So now I'm really pleased to welcome some of our esteemed guests to give some reactions about the report. And first we have Cardinal McCarrick. Cardinal, would you like to speak from your seat, or would you like to speak up here?
I'd like to speak up here because that seems more easily to lean on than my seat.
All right, that sounds great. Well, I'll introduce you and then we'll bring you right up. Theodore Cardinal McCarrick is the Archbishop Emeritus of Washington and a longtime friend of Georgetown and the Center for Muslim-Christian Relations. A human rights advocate, he served as Archbishop of DC from 2001 to 2006, and he's known for his dedication to humanitarian causes and improving education. His Eminence is also a dear friend of the DC area Muslim community, and he is known for his powerful demonstrations of solidarity with his Muslim friends. So we are grateful that he could be with us today to react to the report, especially since he's recovering from knee surgery. So thank you.
One changes one's list of heroes and heroines as one grows older. I have a number of heroes and heroines here. Cara is one of my heroes and heroines. As our first speaker indicated, Cara is essential in all these things, and Tom is here. I owe him money, but I don't. I'm not trying to take care of my debt by saying nice things. but because I really believe that what he has done, what he continues to do, is extraordinary for American sociology and for the understanding of the mind of our country and of our Catholic people. Drew Christensen is another one of my heroes. Years ago, I was a distinguished professor, I think. I don't know what it was. I wasn't distinguished something. Or maybe it was extinguished. I'm not sure. One of them. But I was a scholar at the Library of Congress, and I was very disturbed by the murder of a Pakistani Catholic who fought against the blasphemy laws and was killed. And by the fact that there were two different kinds of reactions. There were a reaction on the part of people in the street who thought this was a wonderful thing, and not the Muslim people in the street, not the Catholic people in the street. And the leadership of the Muslim communities all around the world, they thought it was a horrible thing. At least that's what publicly were being said by the two sides. And I called Drew and I said, I'm going to do an article. He said, fine. He said, do you know what you're talking about? I said, no. He said, then first learn and then do the article. Well, I haven't done the article yet because I'm still trying to learn the complex situation that we face. Not only it's hard enough for Catholics to understand each other, but to understand Islam is a great challenge and a great adventure. But all of that decision to try to learn more about Islam comes from my professor, Dr. Christensen, who is certainly one of the brightest men in America. Why did I stop at America? Anyway. But talking about heroes, I just want to say this, and then I'll get on to the business at hand. As you see, I'm having trouble walking. I'm having trouble learning to walk again, and and my heroes now are little kids of 1.5 and 2 years old who learn how to walk the first time. I never realized how hard it was, and yet they do it. And I never realized why parents are saying, "Oh, isn't he wonderful? He's walking. He took 2 steps today," and I have never realized that's absolutely true. A kid who takes 2 steps at 1.5 is a great hero, and he's going to be one of my heroes from now on. So all of you who have taken 2 steps by the time you're 2 years old, congratulations. I do appreciate how hard that is. I never appreciated before how hard it is. It's well, maybe when you're 86, it's a little easier because you don't remember anything, not only what you did 83.5 years ago, but still this whole opportunity of seeing in our own lives how things that we take for granted are very hard sometimes, and how we become more able to appreciate the heroism that lies even in a little kid who was only maybe 1.5 feet off the ground, getting that whole 1.5 feet and looking around him or her and saying, "Ooh, look where I am now." I'm having trouble doing it without catching on to something, but that's because I think as you get deep into your 80s, you become more, I want to say cowardly, but then I don't want to make enemies of all my co-octogenarians. But anyway, before I forget, Dr. Esposito is certainly one of my heroes too, because he has proven that you don't have to be a Muslim to really appreciate Islam, and he has, and that is such a, you would think this is not a big thing, but it is, and as you read and as you discuss and as you see the implications of this study, you can see in there this remarkable thing which we have done to try to understand. Life is more filled with understanding than anything else, I think, and Dr. Esposito and the folks in CARA are not just reporters, they're trying to be understanders, to help us understand. And that's always been John's real desire. He just doesn't report, he just doesn't teach, he tries to find out the implications, these extraordinary implications of who we are and of what we're all about. But to get on to what I'm supposed to be doing, I am not surprised at the report, because I do, but I'm different because since I've been very much involved with Islam, I do read so many things with regard to Islam. If there's anything in a paper, in a magazine, whether it be Catholic or secular or whatever, I read it, and I'm aware of the striking similarities that our researchers have found among Christians, among Catholics especially. We are living through a period of time in which we first realized what Islamophobia was. And because 15 years ago we celebrated or faced the horror of 9/11. And however that affected our understanding of Islam, however it affected our understanding of what Islam was, what Islam does, and all those things connected with it. That this is a very topical consideration that we're in today, because that, I think, began the real implications of Islam in our own lives. I was disappointed in the fact that a prelate was quoted as saying, and I know he did this, that we don't worship the same God, as if there's more than one. You know how foolish a statement. And this is a brilliant man. I really wish that we would read what he's saying and understand what he's saying. You know, someone said to me once, I was giving a talk here in Washington on Islam, and they said, well, when you look at the God that the Muslims worship, and you look at, I said, wait, hold on, there is only one God, and when we forget that, then we really lose the whole picture. There is only one God. I usually begin speaking to Muslim audiences saying, in the name of God, the merciful and compassionate. And sometimes people say, who's the God, the merciful and compassionate? I said, there's only one God, and therefore he is, or this great divinity of ours is merciful and compassionate. We know that. And Islam approaches it one way, we approach it another way. I'm prejudiced, of course. I spent all my whole life as a Catholic and as a Catholic priest. I will be next year 40 years a Catholic bishop. So that so you get a certain mindset after all that, and that's the mindset that I freely and gladly confess to. But it helps me to realize that anyone who wants to approach the divinity, anyone who wants to approach God, whatever name they use, whatever road they take, I do know with all my heart I believe in the road that I have taken. But I rejoice to find anyone who says, I believe in God, and I believe in a God who is merciful. And as you look at the 99 beautiful names of God that our Muslim brothers and sisters present to us, you know, how full of theology, and even Catholic theology, that is, and how important. But I am not surprised, to get back to where I'm supposed to be, I am not surprised at the misunderstanding of Islam by Catholics, and then even sometimes by Catholic teachers who ought to know better. And part of it is fear. You mentioned it earlier. Part of it is fear, because we fear what we do not totally understand. But the only way to get rid of the fear is to try to understand more clearly. And if we're not doing that, then we're bad. Years ago, working with Muslims, some of us came up with a litany, and I'll share it with you. This is not the first time you've heard me say it, because I have only like 3 or 4 ideas, and this is one of them. Into religious dialogue, you begin by talking with the other. Talking with the other does not imply in any way that the other is listening. It's talking with the other. The second step is talking to the other, and there's a big difference because we know in our own lives with people with whom we do not agree, there can be many long conversations, but it's just I'm saying what I want to say, and he or she is saying what they want to say, and there's no connection. No one's really listening. We're talking and not listening. So the first stage in interreligious dialogue, unfortunately, is talking to the other person. I'm sorry, it's talking with the other person and not to the other person. And once you begin talking to the other person, then you reach a second stage, and then that second stage is to try to understand the other person. If you're talking with another person and you're just talking, you're saying what you want to say, and you're not listening, then there's no progress in that. But once that talking to the other person forces you to try to understand what they're saying, that's the next great stage. And then once you try to understand what other people are saying, then the next great rung in the ladder is to appreciate what they're saying. Why do they say this? Why do they believe this? What's the implication? You can't make any progress in life without attempting to make sure that you understand, that you not just try to understand, but to appreciate why people are saying this. And once you do that, then you can begin to work together. Then you can come into cooperation. You can't get to cooperation if you skip any of those stages. But if you skip one, then you find yourself lost in the maya, or the morass of trying to say where the light is, where the truth is. But when you deal with religion, of course, there is so much that is so important to understand, and so important to realize, and so important for us to each understand that we do not really understand totally the mysteries of our own faith, let alone the mysteries of the faith of others. And so all of this is involved in what John Esposito has been doing for the last many years, and what those who have been working with him have constantly been working on. What do you do about what we have heard today? What do you do about the lack of understanding, the lack of trust, the lack of real insight in our own people, and in certain circumstances in our own leadership? Well, let me give you 2 or 3 suggestions. Number one, you have to continue to read. You have to continue to study. Islam is not the easiest thing to study. Even with such a brilliant teacher as John Esposito, it's still a bushel of facts and of history and of philosophy and theology and all these things wrapped together, and of mysticism and of poetry. It's a great poetry. You go back to El Arabi and then see the poetry that moves that has moved Islam forward in so many ways. But how do we get people to study? How do we get people to understand? Well, I think one of the ways is to appreciate that we must read more, and I would hope that people would read this study and get to understand the extraordinary things that has brought to the light. It opens the door into ourselves, not just into the world outside, because we are all the victims is the wrong word, but we are all the relics of the difficulties that we face in understanding things that we do not totally appreciate. Years ago, our Muslim friends realized that they weren't being understood. It was right after 9/11, or maybe 2 or 3 years after 9/11, and the leadership of the Muslim community in the United States, the ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, issued a fatwa that they worked on very, very carefully, and very, very courageously, because they realized that all of Islam was not going to understand this, just as all of Christianity does not understand this. And they issued this fatwa that said human life is important. Human life cannot be taken. There is value in the human being. And you could almost see Catholic social teaching riding across the pages of what their fatwa said. They issued a fatwa at the Washington, the National Press Club, and I was very much involved. I was the one who received it from them, and there were hundreds of maybe exaggeration. There were dozens of press there, and it never appeared anywhere. And that is one of the problems that we have. Anyone who has worked with Islam so often knows the press loves to tell you all the terrible things, and the press is very hesitant to tell you any of the good things. And yet, there are terrible things. Absolutely, to deny that would be stupid. But there are certain wonderful things too. And this was a great courageous thing on the part of the leadership of the American Muslim community. But it went no further. And I keep, anytime I go to a meeting, I always talk about this because I think it is so important for others. If I'm in a meeting in Istanbul or in Kurdistan or anywhere, I talk about what our American leadership has done and what they are saying. And then people say, we never knew that. We never knew that. There is something else much more current, and I'm coming now to the end of what I want to say because I only had 5 minutes, and I think I talked for at least a half hour. But John Esposito was such a gentleman; he won't say anything until it's all over, and then he'll say, you talked long. But in February of this last year, there was in Marrakesh, in Morocco, a gathering of Islamic leaders from all over the world. There were about 300 of them there, and they represented just about every strain of Islam, from the Sufi to the Salafi, and represented all the judicial positions of the different Islamic courts and Islamic jurisdictions. And they were together for several days, and not always peacefully, but they came up with a remarkable document, and it is called the Marrakesh Declaration. For some reason, I had been invited as one of the non-Muslims. There were maybe about 25 or 30 non-Muslims there. I was one of them, and we sat with them, we studied with them. We were not there when they did their final document, which was helpful because it let them speak to themselves and not to everybody else. So that was very, very important. What we found in there was a document that really is a beautiful expression of the very best that is in Islam. And I would recommend it to anyone who knows Islam or wants to know Islam or studies Islam. The Marrakesh Declaration. At the end of the declaration, which is not long, maybe 2-3 pages, I always get presented with these things. They presented it to me, and scared the heck out of me because I wasn't sure really what the final document was going to be, and here I am, going to say this is wonderful or this is terrible, and I decided it was wonderful. And then I said, okay, I may be excommunicated at the end of this day, but it didn't happen. And the Holy Father himself has mentioned the document that he was pleased with it, and I think it is. I really recommend it to anyone who is studying Islam to read and study the Marrakesh Declaration. It is an excellent document, and it goes back to the Treaty of Medina, right to the Prophet's time, peace be upon him and all those who worked with him to produce a document so peaceful as this, and so filled with the teaching that we ourselves have been teaching. It is a very, very important document. if you haven't read it, you should read it. In fact, I'm going to go way out and say, if you haven't even read my reaction to it, you should read that too. You might make more sense out of it than I did after it, but I think it's really, you all would be, if you study it, you all would be as delighted as I have been and still am with the fact that this is the real Islam, and it reflected Islam from Bangladesh to modern America, and this is what I think when we find that this is what truly we are teaching in Islam. This is worthwhile for us all to understand and to build on and to build bridges on. You know, we are talking about bridges. This is a bridge initiative, and indeed, if you need a bridge, I give you the bridge. I give you the Marrakesh Declaration. It is a bridge which will be helpful to all of us, no matter how small or large our understanding of it is. For a while, I entered this because I am a Catholic bishop, and if I do not say anything about Catholic bishops, they will not talk to me for at least 3 years. Number one, the Catholic bishops of the United States have had an interreligious dialogue for many years, and some of the brightest of our gang has been in this work, and they have come up with some very fine statements, which I think I would recommend as worthy of reading. But because of the growing importance of all of this, they have now named a super committee under the presidency of one of the brightest fellows we have, the present Archbishop of Chicago, Archbishop Switch, who I think many of you who have seen his writings and who have understood the leadership that he plays and will continue to play in American Catholic life. But he has been named chairman of a committee on Islam, and I think we should watch and see what comes out of that committee, because I think it will be of extraordinary value to us all. So, what's the role for us? Read, continue to study, talk to our Muslim brothers and sisters. You will learn a great deal. You will learn a great deal that you will find to be very consoling and very rewarding. And if you listen carefully, sometimes very concerning, because their opinion on us is sometimes almost as bad as ours about theirs, and that maybe the next thing you have to do is do the same thing about Christianity in the idea of the Muslims, and see where they are. That would be. I know it's not the strict program of CARA, but it would be a very interesting other companion dialogue to see where all is and where we could be. There is so much we can always learn. I go back to Father Christensen when he wouldn't let me make a stupid statement, but I am convinced that there is so much to learn, and so much of it is wonderful. And if we begin to understand and to say and to appreciate how much is wonderful in Islam, I have no doubt that Islam will open up and say and find many more wonderful things that we have too. These are important days. These are important, challenging days, difficult days, and yet, if we play this game right, if we move along the right road, that road goes to peace. It goes to understanding, and it goes even to happiness. And none of us, even my heroic 1.5-year-old who just learned how to walk, will turn down an opportunity to find peace and happiness and a lot of balance. God bless you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Let me find my way back. Okay, I'm good. Just think those little kids are able to do this. It's wonderful.
Next, we're going to hear from Scott Alexander, PhD, who is currently Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where he is also the director of the school's Catholic Muslim Studies program and the chair of the Department of Intercultural Studies and Ministry. He is co-editor of the Journal of Muslim Philanthropy and Civic Engagement and sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture. He serves on the Academic Council of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and is on the steering committee of the Bridge Initiative, both here at Georgetown. He is a regular consultant on Catholic-Muslim relations for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Catholic Association for Diocesan Ecumenical and Interreligious Officers. In addition to working on a current book project focusing on triumphalism in Christian-Muslim relations, he is the author of a number of articles in Islamic history, Quranic studies, Christian-Muslim relations, and interreligious dialogue published in journals, encyclopedias, and volumes. Thank you.
Greetings of peace to all, and to my Muslim sisters and brothers here today, a very blessed Eid al-Adha. There's a favorite hadith of mine, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, "Man la yashkur an-nas la yashkur Allah," which roughly translates, the person who does not thank his or her fellow human beings cannot possibly presume to thank God. So first, I'd like to thank His Eminence Cardinal McCarrick for the courageously evangelical pastoral leadership he has provided the American Catholic Church as the Church responds to the call of the Second Vatican Council for the faithful to strive to understand, love, and engage more fully with our Muslim sisters and brothers in concerted action for the sake of the greater solidarity of the human family. I can personally attest, as Jordan did earlier, to how beloved His Eminence is among the U.S. American Muslims who know him, and it is a status, I assure you, by God's grace he has earned. Second, I have to thank one of my most faithful and treasured mentors, Professor John Esposito, responsible for what little good I've managed to accomplish in my scholarship and ministry, and none of the bad stuff. Yeah, the bad stuff, yeah. And I also want to thank Father Drew Christensen for giving of his time and energy to contribute to his incredible insight to this panel of ours. And last but not least, I want to thank Jordan Denari Duffner, Research Fellow of the Bridge Initiative and rising star, as you could see, in the study and practice of Catholic-Muslim relations. As you all know, without Jordan's superbly executed, painstaking, and much-needed research resulting in this important report, none of us would be here today. I have 4 questions that center on 2 of the findings of the report that stood out for me. And perhaps the single most important one is this. It's on page 44 and following. Catholics who consume Catholic media have more negative view of Muslims than those who don't. Another closely related finding, which calls to me personally and actually pricks my conscience, is that of the writers featured in the report on pages 88 through 97, none have formal PhD level training in Islamic studies and or Christian-Muslim relations. Clearly, those of us who are credible Catholic scholars of Islam are not writing enough for larger audiences. So the 4 questions are these, beginning with the first that relates to these 2 closely related findings of the research. How and why does such a wide variety of polemical literature on Islam and Muslims get such play in various Catholic fora, especially at the congregational level? And more specifically, how do self-identified Catholics such as Robert Spencer and Scott Hahn get away with it without any public censor from the Catholic hierarchy? At least none that I know of. First answer, possibly, is because magisterially, polemicism is still very much accepted and oftentimes even encouraged within the context of the church's relationship with people of other religious traditions and the faiths they profess. The one notable exception to this rule is with respect to Jews and Judaism, and the one example of this rule on steroids, if you will, is with respects to Muslims and Islam. Second question. Given that polemicism is clearly distinct from and at odds with dialogue, and given the theoretical centrality of dialogue to the church's mission in the world, you'll note there is not a pontifical council for interreligious polemic, why is polemicism still tolerated? Despite the centrality of dialogue, it is still standard for Catholic catechesis to send either a subtle or not so subtle triumphalist message to the faithful that a commitment to the church's absolute truth claims must entail a commitment to have these claims win over all others. I would argue not only that such a message is entirely unnecessary for a commitment to the universal truth manifest in the person of Jesus Christ and his gospel, but I would argue that it is deeply flawed. It's a theological fallacy even, and ultimately at odds with the most basic gospel values. There's no time to elaborate on this point here, but I would like to note that the problem of both Christian and Muslim triumphalism in Christian-Muslim relations is the subject of the book manuscript I'm currently working feverishly to finish. The third question. Why are most, if not all, of the more prominent polemicists, non-experts at least, have no formal doctoral level training in Islamic studies and Christian-Muslim relations? The answer they and their supporters, funders, and publishers tend to give usually comes in one of two forms, or some combination of both. The first is that the vast majority of people with PhDs in Islamic studies are brainwashed by the secular liberalism which has corrupted all but the most theologically conservative corners of the academy. The second is that we professional Islamicists have all come under the spell of Muslims in general and so-called political Islamists in particular. Or even worse, some of these experts are actually wolves in sheep's clothing, crypto-Islamic fundamentalists and or radicals who are working incognito to advance the Muslim takeover of the West by attempting to lull populations into complacency in the face of what is known as Sharia creep. This second approach is particularly deployed when dealing with Catholic experts, especially those who fit the Islamophilic category, a category into which I unapologetically place myself. One of my personal favorites in terms of how I have been characterized as either a dupe or a crypto-Islamic fundamentalist is the appellation, quote, reprehensible dhimmi toad, end quote. For those of you that don't know what a dhimmi is, it's a member of the Ahl al-Dhimma who were protected peoples, protected religious minorities during the medieval period in Islamic countries according to religious law, but obviously we're in a second-class status, and so dhimmi toad. What this amounts to is a suggestion that if you actually know Muslims and have extensive experience with living Muslim communities, to the extent that these communities recognize you as someone who, for the most part, tries to represent them in ways that are faithful to their own self-representation, then somehow you are suspect. This, by the way, is not a healthy hermeneutic of suspicion, but rather a hermeneutic of abstraction and alienation, antithetical to magisterial Catholic theology of dialogue. And the fourth question. Why is it that even Islamophilic Catholic authors on Islam, who get the widest possible readership, for example, Deacon George Dardis and Sister Meg Funk, who are mentioned on pages 91 to 92 of the report, are also non-experts? I have two hypotheses. Early on, when I first came to Catholic Theological Union, I was asked to do a book like this. But I couldn't because I was still trying to earn tenure. For the non-expert Islamophilic authors, it can be a career maker or booster to publish such books. For the experts, it is generally not something they can afford to put much energy into until they are mid-career or later career. Of course, this is no excuse. My attempt to make my own contribution is to try to kill two proverbial birds with one stone and write a book that is a hybrid. If I'm successful, it won't be quite as widely accessible as some of Spencer and Han's material, but it won't be completely irrelevant, inshallah, God willing. This doesn't quite explain why some popular books by noted and highly credentialized Islamophilic experts like Georgetown's own John Esposito, widely recognized as one of the deans of Islamic studies in the Global Academy, do not command the same readership as those of his Islamophobic counterparts within the Catholic community who's consuming this stuff. Is it that Professor Esposito tends to publish even his more popular work with prestigious academic publishers who aren't well positioned to market to popular Catholic audiences? Or that Professor Esposito doesn't write these works for Catholics per se, but for a more general audience? I think both are probably true. But let us not overlook the first principle of moral foundations theory. According to Jonathan Haidt, in his fairly well-known book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, the first principle of moral foundations theory is that intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. Once I was going to give a talk at a large Catholic parish in northern Illinois. And as I was setting up the projector and hooking up my computer, and people were coming in at the beginning, about a half an hour before we started, a woman came down, very eagerly came down the aisle with a book in her hand, waving the book. And the book was Robert Spencer's The Truth About Muhammad, Founder of the World's Most Intolerant Religion. And she said to me, Professor Alexander, I'm reading this book, I'm wondering what you think about it. So I had a rare Socratic moment, and I asked her, well, what do you think about it? And she said, I think it's terrific. And I said, well, can you tell me why? What are some of the criteria you're applying to judge the book that way? And she said, it just confirms everything I see on television. And I told her they should put that as a blurb on the back of the book. Because it does. It's kind of honest assessment. And for those people that are looking for books on Islam that confirm everything they see on television, it's a great book. For people that want books on Islam that challenge some of what they see on television, it's not so good. This is what will make Jordan's forthcoming and predictably excellent volume for liturgical press somewhat difficult to reach the same audiences that Spencer and Han reach. It's similar to the reason Rachel Maddow isn't someone social conservatives are by and large interested in watching, and Sean Hannity, someone social progressives aren't for the most part interested in watching. Add to this the fact that the US bishops have been sending a subtle message for years now that faithful citizenship does not allow for support of any party or candidate that supports abortion rights or gay marriage, for example. And we can see a little bit about how the demographics of at least official adult ed in many Catholic parishes around the country take shape. And I have no data to back this up. This is just somewhat anecdotal and my reflections, my quick reflections on the report. So I have no statistics to back up what I'm about to say, but it's my impression that these official adult ed programs in all but the most progressive of Catholic parishes in the US have a self-selected majority of folk who would identify themselves as social conservatives. And like the woman in the parish in northern Illinois, and indeed, as Haidt teaches us, like all human beings, these folk more naturally gravitate to those ideas that support their existing institutions. So I'm just wondering, I don't know, I'm wondering whether those folks in parishes who would identify themselves as more social progressives, but the parish is either evenly divided or maybe a little more socially conservative, whether adult education fora that take place, recommendations for books to read about Islam, offer a more progressive perspective rather than a perspective that would be more associated with social conservatism and Fox News coverage of Islam, etc. Which leads me to my concluding observation. The struggle against anti-Semitism, the ongoing struggle against anti-Semitism in the US Catholic Church and in US society in general has not made the strides it has because of Nostra Aetate or even because of adequate catechesis regarding Jews, Judaism, and Christian-Muslim relations. Rather, it is because, and Cardinal McCarrick made reference to this, and Professor Christensen will make further reference to this in his remarks, it's because of embodied relationships between Catholics and Jews, ranging from the workplace to the nuclear family and every sphere and social forum in between. With God's grace and help, the same process will unfold between Catholics and Muslims as it has and continues between Catholics and Jews. If, that is, we can effectively resist the forces at work in our society, which are precisely designed and arrayed to thwart the transformative power of people of different ethnicities and religions. To borrow a phrase from the verse of the Quran, to thwart these people from coming together to know one another. I hope and pray that we can resist this tendency. I'm also convinced that if we do succeed, God willing, in championing dialogue, understanding, and cooperation over polemic, ignorance, and alienation in Catholic-Muslim relations, research such as the research that Jordan conducted will have played a critical role in achieving this sacred end. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Finally, we have Jesuit Father Drew Christensen, who is a distinguished professor of ethics and global human development at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University. He is also a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. For 13 years, he advised the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on Middle East affairs, and he has also served as a consultant to the Holy See on related issues. Father Drew, thank you.
I want to thank John Esposito and Jordan for their invitation to be here. It's a privilege to be here with Cardinal McCarrick, who is a good longtime friend. I was privileged to serve with him in many capacities in the Middle East, in the Balkans, and also on China for several years. And he's always a pleasure to work with. He exaggerates my influence, I think. I'm going to make 3 quick points. I took Jordan's advice very seriously about 5 minutes once I got the second notice that it's going to be only 5 minutes, so it's only 2 sides of a page, and we can talk about it later. I've tried to be constructive in making some recommendations how the difficulties can be addressed. So first, to my mind, the most disturbing fact uncovered in Danger and Dialogue is that U.S. Catholics are less likely than the average American to know a Muslim. 3 in 10 American Catholics know a Muslim, whereas in the general U.S. population, 4 in 10 do. Personal knowledge makes a difference. 4 times as many people who know Muslims have very favorable attitudes toward them as compared to those who don't have that personal knowledge. Even casual encounters can improve relations. A case in point. Cardinal McCarrick, I think, was a witness to this event. The Shrine of Our Lady of Lebanon overlooks the Bay of Junais and is a tall ziggurat topped by a larger-than-life statue of Mary. When several years ago I was descending the ziggurat with a group of bishops, we met an upward stream of Muslim women ascending the shrine. Afterwards, I learned that all over the world, Muslim women pray at Catholic shrines in honor of Mary, asking for fertility, safe childbirth, and healings of women's health issues. One promising fact in the report is that 47% of Catholics regard the purpose of interreligious dialogue is to learn about and grow closer to God. During sabbatical 3 years ago, for the first time, I shared in a Catholic Muslim prayer and support group called Abadaliyah at St. Paul's Church in Cambridge. That monthly meeting became for me a proof of how Muslims and Christians can build up one another's faith through spiritual encounter. Second, the report tells us that the words dialogue and interfaith dialogue are terms well known among Catholics. But the level and frequency of dialogue with Muslims are far less lower than they ought to be, given the significance of for the global common good of what Pope Francis calls social peace between Christians and Muslims. One reason for the low level of dialogue is that many dioceses have reduced or eliminated their offices for ecumenical and interfaith affairs in recent years. If Catholic attitudes are to improve, American Catholic attitudes, Those offices need to be reestablished and strengthened, and many more priests, deacons, and lay leaders trained to participate in interfaith undertakings. Seminaries especially need to include interfaith dialogue in their curricula. 3, it is an axiom of journalism that if a story bleeds, it leads. So we should not be astonished that the negative stories about the persecution of Christians makes the headlines, whereas the prayerful nonviolence of Sufis and other pacifist Muslim groups seldom do. The link the report makes between Catholic media, Catholic book publishers, and Islamophobia needs to be severed. I see this as a task of the Catholic Press Association or the Association of Catholic Publishers, and I think they ought to take it up as part of their regular business. It'd be a mark of professional maturity, and I say this as former editor of America, and I'm happy that America comes out pretty good in this report, or at least our readers do. It would be a remark of professional maturity if the Catholic press was willing to monitor itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Father. So we're running a little short on time, but I want to give all of you a quick few moments to ask a couple of questions. So I think we'll take about 2 questions. Can someone give me the time? I just want to make sure that.
It's 5 minutes to 2.
5 minutes to 2. Okay, so we can take probably 2 or 3 questions. We're going to have some mics going around so you can ask questions of me about the report or of our wonderful panel as well.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Farrell, and I'm the executive director of the Franciscan Action Network. And first, I just want to give a shameless promotion. We're working on a project with The Bridge, with Cardinal McCarrick, and with a number of others called The Sultan and the Saint. It's a docudrama telling the story of St. Francis and the Sultan, and it's going to be premiered here in Washington, D.C. on November 12th, so you're all invited to come to that premiere. I do have a question, though. I know the professor kind of touched on this a little bit. If a Catholic theologian, scholar, wrote a book on gay marriage, in support of gay marriage, and somehow it managed to find its way into the Basilica bookstore because they didn't read it, they didn't look at the title, and the Bishops' Conference found out about it, it would be about 5 minutes before that book was taken off the shelf, and the person probably would have been fired who actually put it on there. Yet we have books written by a person who promotes hatred and violence against our Muslim brothers and sisters. They know that it's on that bookshelf. The Bishops' Conference knows that it's there, and yet it's still, if I drive by there, I'll stop this afternoon, it'll still be on that bookshelf. How come that is?
So I think it's because these people aren't overtly and maybe even unintentionally promoting violence against Muslims. That's one thing, right? Second, it's because of this polemic. The church still thinks, in large part, that a polemical approach to Islam is essential to the assertion of its own truth claims. And I think that, at least theologically and magisterially, that's the piece that most kind of insulates these kinds of publications from public censor by the hierarchy.
Any of you have comments you'd like to share as well? Or?
Yeah, I would disagree with that. I don't know if this, yeah, the mic is on. I think that what is determining that is more a group of people who have a self-defined kind of orthodoxy, who think the polemics is part of sustaining that self-defined orthodoxy, but it's not the orthodoxy of the church, which requires dialogue and respect for Muslims.
Any other questions? Andrew.
Yes, Supreme Knight Carl Anderson of the Knights of Columbus recently spoke at the In Defense of Christians Conference last week, and in his gala dinner remarks last Friday, he delineated between universal human rights and the restrictions of those rights under Islamic Sharia as pronounced in the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights from 1990 by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And he's, along those lines, talked about how Muslim discrimination against Christians and legal norms and otherwise throughout the Middle East is often a precursor to genocide, as we're now witnessing with ISIS. Is Supreme Knight Carl Anderson's comments, are they in line with Catholic teaching, or should they be taught at Catholic institutions? Or
You know, I wouldn't comment specifically on those comments. I'm not sure if they're quite about theology, and I think the church has not gotten that specific, honestly, about what it teaches about Islam. I also want to point out, Andrew didn't introduce himself. Andrew writes for Front Page Magazine, which is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which Robert Spencer's website is also under that David Horowitz Freedom Center. So
I can say to that I can't speak for the Catholic bishops, for instance, of the United States. I can't speak for Pope Francis. I cannot speak and should not speak for the magisterium. I can speak for myself as an individual practicing Catholic and say absolutely, Anderson, and I know him. He's a very good man. He's a very fine man. But I can say that unfortunately his assessment of the data is quite flawed and skewed. And I would also point out that Mr. Anderson is not an expert in Islam or Islamic studies or Middle Eastern politics.
well, yes, Father.
Let me add a note here. I think that the Catholic-Muslim dialogue that doesn't take into account human rights is flawed. It's incomplete. And when you have major countries like Saudi Arabia to deprive Christians of their religious liberty, you have a problem. When you have a group, you have Christians expelled from their homes across 2 countries, that's a major problem. And you have to deal with that. The Holy See in its dialogues divides the dialogues between theological dialogues and dialogues on those difficulties. And I think it's important that we continue to dialogue on those difficulties.
If I can say, though, that I agree with you, but to essentialize those very serious human rights violations as having something to do with Islam is the problem I think we're talking about here. Mostly those human rights violations take place in societies that are suffering from all of the ills that Catholic social teaching attempts to address. And it's a fundamental betrayal of Catholic social teaching, really, I think, on a very foundational level. To suggest that somehow we don't have to pay attention to all those structural evils that cause those kinds of rifts in these societies and just focus, as Mr. Spencer, Mr. Hahn, and other people want us to do, on some flawed gene in Islam.
Dr. Esposito.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Take another question.
Sure, we'll take one more question. Sir Ratib. Oh, wait for the mic, sorry. Thank you.
This is a beautiful book, Jordan, and I want to see how I can, as I'm into the grassroots level where I'm the chair for the Muslim Christian Coalition, how we can teach Catholics and Christians in general, and how we can let them know about Islam, because that's a crusade for us to understand that because if the Christians in the United States understand Islam, then we'll save our Christianity in the Holy Land and in the Middle East. How we can take that book to other level.
So I'll let our guests respond to that, but Sir Ratib is the head of the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation, so thank you for your question. Any thoughts on how we can bring this forward? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there's got to be a multi-pronged approach. I mean, number one, in terms of change, and this is true for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. I'm not going to go beyond that in terms of religions. We could go on and on. It's got to be introduced into the education of the religious leaders, number one. It does no good as the Marrakesh Statement is, as good as the Amman message is. It does no good if you have top religious leaders who sign things, but then who are busy about many other things, and it doesn't get into what's being taught, if you will, I use this term in the broadest sense, in the seminaries, training, the next generation of religious leaders. It's also very important to get it into the educational system. And it is to a certain extent, but not as much as it should be. And that's why you can wind up with the kinds of statements that were just quoted by the Grand Knight or whatever. I have seen this. We have a whole generation of Roman Catholics who are very bright, many of them very successful professionally, are in every way compassionate within a small circle. But getting outside that circle becomes a problem. And I'll give a personal example here. We had a Filipino priest who officiated over several years for the funerals of my mother and my father. And I was surprised. We were talking, he asked what I did, and I told him, and he said, oh, gee, can you give me some information about Islam? And I said, I'll send you some videos that I've done, etc. I charged him for it, of course, but that's another story. In fact, I charged him more than I should have. Okay, so I give him the material. And then I tell some of my very close Catholic friends, okay, who have the profile I just said, okay? And the response I got was, oh, and I told him the story, and then I said, when I asked the Filipino priest why, he said, well, you know, I come from a family of 2 priests, a nun, and you can imagine in the Philippines how my parents felt when my brother came home and said he had converted to Islam, okay? Now, my Catholic friends then said, that's a really nice story, but we would also hope that he would pray, that people would pray for his immortal soul, okay? You know, that phrase goes back to my own training growing up. And I understand that from within the Catholic tradition. And that, by the way, that mentality exists within across world religions, you know, within certain sectors of the religion. But our challenge today, okay, has to do with a more global understanding of what religious pluralism is about. Okay? And until we get that really put out into the grassroots, it's not going to happen. And that's why projects like the Bridge and others are important. People today don't get most of their information from mass media. They get it from social media. And social media has a dominant force within it, what we call an organized Islamophobic network, and other people have gotten into it, okay, that is well-funded and gets their message out into social media. And so you have websites, not obvious websites like Spencer's Jihad Watch, but websites with things like American Thinker, Family Security. Who isn't for family security? Pajama Media. So we have a broad-based, challenge here.
Do we have time for one more? I think so.
Yeah, you should know, by the way, the reason why we seem rushed is somebody else has the room, and so in order for us to get the room, we had to guarantee that we would get people out at a certain time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Following on John Esposito's remarks and some other comments, what are you going to do to disseminate the findings in this book in the church and beyond?
So, I mean, the Bridge Initiative is happy to work with organizations and institutions to disseminate the report. You know, we don't only have these, printed copies, we've got a PDF version on our website. And so we really hope in the next several weeks to be sharing this widely with Catholic organizations in particular, just so that they're aware of what's in here. You know, people can make their own decisions about what to do with the information. We just hope that they have the information as something to work from. So, please, yeah.
I'm just going to be very brief with the closing. Number one, I want to really thank our commentators today, all of whom I know, and the fact that Cardinal McCarrick came is amazing to me. If I had had a knee operation, if I had some Bombay Sapphire, I would share it with you, but that's, I always feel I have to say that for those who think that maybe I am not really Christian. Okay. Which is an interesting comment. I saw a debate on TV where the person said, it didn't have to do with me, but they worked that in, as if, can you believe these Muslims don't drink? Which I thought was, okay. But the whole idea was, can you really trust anybody, Okay. Can you trust males and females who don't drink and women who wear hijab? There's an issue here. I want to thank them. I want to thank all of you. This is a much better audience than I expected. I hope you're enjoying the booklet that you have, because I don't even have it, so that's, and I really want to thank Jordan for what really was an awesome project. That was superb. Really, really good.
Thank you. Once again, thank you all for coming. We hope you do your duty in sharing this information with those that you know who may find it interesting. Again, if you're talking about it on social media, the hashtag is CatholicMuslimBridge. We thank you all for being here today. Thanks so much.